What's up, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Brown Girl Green podcast. I'm your host, Christy Drutman, where I interview environmental leaders and advocates about creative solutions to the climate crisis. Diversity and inclusion is at the core of the show, always talking about uplifting the voices of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, doing the work to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. I'm so excited to have today's guest today because we're going to be talking about the concept of litigation. I know that's a big word, but basically the idea is thinking about when people are saying, okay, corporations are bad or evil and we need to sue them. Like, what does that actually look like? What does it look like for communities to come together and to address environmental justice in a way using the law? And I don't really know as much about that in terms of like what that looks like and what it's like to work on those things. And so I wanted to bring Jeremy onto the show to kind of discuss how litigation can be a tool for, climate justice, climate activism, and also a tool for storytelling to bring more people into the conversation to advocate for themselves in their communities. And so I love Jeremy to introduce himself about his incredible work on environmental law. And yeah, Jeremy, you can go ahead.
Yeah, sure thing, Christy. Thanks so much for having me. I'm always excited to talk about the issues, but in particular, especially, join platforms that lift up the issues in a way that allow us to tell the stories of various bodies of work that are taking place, in particular from a justice standpoint. So again, my name is Jeremy Orr. I work as the Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships at an organization named Earth Justice, a large public interest law firm that works to protect the environment and public health all over the country. I live in Detroit. That's where I'm from. That's where I'm born and raised, and I work remotely from here. And at Earth Justice, I serve as a Director of Litigation and Advocacy Partnerships, where I work to ensure that our attorneys and our staff are building meaningful, mutually trusting partnerships to deliver on our litigation and policy work.
Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. And to kick us off, I just wanted to ask you, why did you feel becoming an attorney was necessary for addressing the climate crisis?
Yeah, sure thing. I'll start by saying, I didn't feel it was necessary, right? Because I think there are many different roles and ways that we can all chip in and tackle the climate crisis, whether it's, through formal education, like going to law school, or whether it's through our lived experiences of being subject to environmental degradation, right? We all have something to contribute to it. But for me, I knew going to law school was the avenue I wanted to take because it would allow me to advocate in a way that appealed to me. I got my start as a community organizer here in Michigan, right out of college, around 22, 23 years old. And I did all types of organizing, from transportation, affordable housing, youth violence and drug prevention. And there was this one particular issue that really stood out to me, and it was an environmental issue. It was a cleanup of a contaminated Superfund site. And at that point, I hadn't really had any real exposure to environmental advocacy and environmental policy or environmental law. What I knew in that moment was a couple of things. One, as we engaged kind of the government around these issues, it felt like I didn't really understand what was going on, the things they were talking about, the language they were using, the laws and policies. It all felt foreign to me. And then the other thing was there were no people of color in the decision-making processes. And as you can imagine, as we're engaging in government, there's a lot of lawyers involved too, right? And none of the lawyers were people of color. And we were advocating on behalf of a community of color where this environmental degradation was taking place. So those two things really stood out to me. One, I didn't understand what was going on, and I wanted to go back to school and get an education that would allow me to process information, break it down, and then communicate it to communities in a way that they can engage themselves, right? And then the second part was wanting to be able to represent the community that I come from and communities that look like ours in a higher space, right? In a legal advocacy space. So that's what kind of drove me to it, this idea of being able to better communicate information, complex information, to engage more meaningfully and be able to protect and defend and represent our communities in these spaces where we don't always have representation.
So in a way, becoming a lawyer was an avenue for you to be able to bring that representation, to be able to tell those stories and represent communities that you felt otherwise wouldn't have access to those spaces. And you were like, okay, I'm going to insert myself and be the one to be able to create that representation and create those pathways.
Yeah, that's right. I think it's both, right? Access to information and then access to the power, right? In the tables where decisions are being made, and not just, to access for myself, but be able to step into those spaces to then create the opening for communities to also
Mm.
come to those tables, right? So it was really just me creating a space at the table to then hand it off to communities to do the work that they already know how to do to protect themselves.
Oh, I love that. And, that's a big part of what I know Earth Justice is about. I've done work, campaigns and content working with Earth Justice. And, something that I really admired is that they're always about like centering communities in the center of these fights when it comes to environmental justice, which is, I think a strong asset of the organization. But I was wondering, like, in your own work, like, what are some of the cases that you have worked on with Earth Justice that you feel have had the biggest impacts?
Yeah, I think that's right. Going back to what you said, Earth Justice being an organization that's been really intentional about centering those partnerships in our litigation and policy advocacy, and that's really what my actual role is about, right? At Earth Justice, I don't do as much or really any kind of litigation directly anymore, but my role in my department, the litigation and advocacy partnership team, was created to do just that, right? To ensure that our attorneys are centering community, well, partnering with clients that are impacted, partnering with community clients, partnering with community organizations, and centering them in our litigation and advocacy so that it's
Mm.
led by them, right? And we're taking the orders from them. And I think the role that I'm in is really unique for a big green organization like ours. I don't think I've seen somebody, similar to my role at some of the other organizations. So it's a really cool opportunity. And as I mentioned, for me, I don't necessarily engage in the litigation myself, but being able to support the work of our attorneys and making sure that they're partnering with clients has been great. I know, one example we had our FERC team that does federal, energy advocacy. Was able to connect them with a local NAACP chapter in a community where rulemaking was coming up and federal rulemaking was coming up, and this community was looking to be represented and have their voice heard. And our attorneys on our FERC practice was, also looking to actually really lift up a community that would be impacted by the issue of rulemaking. And we were able to partner the two and just go through this process in a way that was so meaningful and impactful for that local NAACP chapter. And I remember them reaching back out and just talking about how grateful they were for an organization like Earth Justice to be able to step up and provide that technical expertise where otherwise they wouldn't have necessarily been able to. That's just kind of one example of the work that I
Yeah.
do, at least that I do on a daily basis. And then, of course, we have an amazing, climate and clean energy practice that does, work all over the country. I know we have our Midwestern team is working with the community in Flint to push back on an asphalt plant that's being built right in the middle of a Black low-income neighborhood that they've been able to engage EPA on and moving in the direction of possible, like, possible settlement, right? Which has been huge in a place like Flint that's already experienced so much environmental degradation and injustice as well. So just thinking of examples like that take place all over the country, and it's really cool to be a part of that work.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. So a big part of the work, it sounds like, I've heard the term like radical listening tossed around in advocacy circles where it's like you're very much focusing on like, listening to the community and understanding their needs and then like also kind of doing an assessment of like, yeah, like you were saying, maybe some of the skill gaps or information gaps that are necessary are those like some of the core processes that go into forming those partnerships. I'm just wondering if there's other like best practices or other ways that like in your position, you all
Yeah.
form those relationships because I'm sure that takes some time to do that.
Yeah, no, it does. Like you mentioned, like building those relationships, like you have to build trust. And the only way you can build trust is through conversation, right? And one of the things I always encourage our attorneys to do as we enter these communities and look to partnership, it's like listen more than you talk, right? What's the saying, right? Is that there's a reason God gave you two ears and one mouth, right? And that's serious though, right? It's, we do have some level of expertise, but it's always important for our attorneys to understand like, hey, these communities that we represent, like they're the real experts. They may not have the titles and the credentials, but they have the lived experience and they can really tell you what's going on the ground. And that's part of my work. And a big part of my work has been how do we operationalize that, right? My experience as an organizer has taught me how to listen and do the one-on-ones and find those shared values and find those shared points of respect, right? And build on that, right? To build that relationship.
Yeah.
And what I've been doing throughout my legal career was marrying the two, right? Like marrying the organizing with the legal advocacy to do my work in a very community movement lawyering way. And my work at Earth Justice has really been how do I take what's in my head, put it on paper, and operationalize it. And like you mentioned, there are just some core principles that that are paramount to building meaningful relationships with communities, especially frontline communities. And listening is at the top of that list, right? Just being able to really
Mhm.
fully listen, appreciate, and understand what communities are going through, what communities need, and what solutions communities want. Because oftentimes, attorneys can come into communities thinking they know the solution. It may be litigation, it may not be, but oftentimes communities can tell you exactly what they want and need. And that should be the driver of how we do our advocacy.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, there's so many barriers that are put up by the legal system that like makes it unnecessarily hard for marginalized communities to actually be able to advocate for themselves, whether that be like language barriers or like the cost to even have a lawyer, the cost to be able to do data collection when it comes to quote unquote citizen science. All of that stuff requires so many resources and a lot of like access that a lot of communities like don't even A, like have access to, or B, like don't have like the legal jargon or language for. And so it's already like setting them in a position of vulnerability where it's like they know that something's wrong anecdotally and they can express that and tell stories, but to like actually be in those rooms, it seems like, yeah, they're already kind of being put in this position of like, okay, I need to have this form of expertise to be able to actually advocate for myself. So it's like, how do you all like instill that power in those communities? Like how did, like, what have you seen? Like, I'm just curious because I just feel like, we saw with like Flint, Michigan, like communities for many months to years were saying like, my kids are getting sick and like, I'm not feeling well and all these things. And we were seeing it with East Palestine, like communities also being like, okay, they're saying that the water is safe, but like we're still getting sick. So there's always like this like denial almost, and it's like how do you, like, and then communities almost like doubt themselves, and then it can take years for like that evidence to surface up because there needs to be these experts that step in. I don't exactly know what my question in all of that is, but more so like how do you feel like community members, like how do you feel like your role and the work that you all are doing with Earth Justice is helping like give the power back to those communities?
Man, that's a great question, and I'll even go back to one of the first things you said, right? The barriers to access to justice, starting with the language barrier, right? One of the things that I did when I started in this role at Earth Justice over a year ago was centralize translation and interpretation services, right? I put the data in, realized that okay, our interpretation and translation services, the requests have been kind of doubling over the last few years, but oftentimes I was getting this feedback that there were a lot of programs and attorneys who couldn't quite figure out where to go and how to get those resources to our partners. So one of the things my team did was centralize it within the organization. So now any attorney, right, in any program who needs translation and interpretation services for their partners, whether it's litigation or any other sort of advocacy, that attorney can literally just come to my team and say, hey, I need this, right? And I already have a list of services all over the country, national services and local services, right, ready to go, right? So that way there's no reason, right, that we struggle with the language barrier because we have the support, the resources, we'll pay for it, right, as long as it helps move the ball along and it makes it easier for our partners and clients to get the level of justice that they need and deserve, right? So that's one of how we try to put that power back in the hands of our clients. And to your point, like that's really what it's about, right? We show up and we help out, but the work that we do is merely a tool in access to justice, right? Litigation is one form of a tool that can help you get the result of justice that you need, particularly environmental or climate justice, right? There's also the policy advocacy, right? There's also just the sheer political context and political strategy of getting your elected and appointed officials to do what you want them to do, right? It's other kinds of pressure, but it's all the ways we think about it is how do we center and get that power back to them. And I think to your point, right, when you look at a place like Flint, overwhelmingly black, overwhelmingly low income, experienced an environmental crisis in which they were told everything was okay, drink the water's fine, right? They were lied to, right? And you think about it, that obviously an environmental injustice based on race, right, and income. But then you look at a community like East Palestine, which is white, right, overwhelmingly white in the kind of middle of nowhere, Ohio, right, which is overwhelmingly conservative and Republican, and yet the same people are lying to them, right? Like the same folks are lying to them, and you get into this issue of okay, like there's clearly disparities in environmental and climate justice as it gears toward, as it trends towards race and ethnicity and income. But man, now you look at, you see it's more in common, right, than we realize. And the big part of that is, like we're not, we have a common enemy and it isn't each other, right? The common enemy are the people who are continuing to pollute our communities, the people who are continuing to oppress us, right, and continuing to feed us poison, right? In the same way that, they were telling people just, within last week, the water is fine to drink in East Palestine. And I'm looking at the water. My background is in water. I'm looking at the water like that, like I
Not gonna
wouldn't drink
drink
it,
that.
nor would I
Yeah, like
suggest
I saw
anybody
these
drink it.
TikToks and people are like throwing stuff in,
Throwing
and
a
it
rock,
looks like
yeah. And
something
it's
out
like,
of like a
yeah,
horror
it's like all
film
the
or
film on the
like,
water, and the water is turning colors when they throw stuff
yeah.
into it. I'm like, why? Why would I drink that? Why would I let my pet drink that? Why would I wash my
No.
clothes if that's my water source? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, it's the same scenario, right? And it's really it's
Yeah.
as much as it's about race, it's also about power, right? And
Mhm.
how do we shift that power back to the community so that they don't experience that environmental oppression?
What are some like wins or victories that you've seen? Like, it can either be stuff that you've like personally have like worked on or things that you've just witnessed in the environmental litigation space where you felt like it truly was a win for communities. Because it just feels like those are so few and far between sometimes because it can take years. And so I'm just wondering from your experience, like of doing this work for so long, like what are some wins that you've seen?
Yeah, no, they really are. I think you hit the nail on the head, right? Like we don't see wins in this field often. And I think that's across many fields of social justice, right? We work
Yeah,
really hard for really long to get these wins,
closer.
and oftentimes they're big wins, but it's the little wins along the way that that
Mhm.
that are important and they keep us going. I think the Flint water crisis is one while we're still watching that kind of play out as they
Yeah.
get to nearing the end of replacing all the pipes. It's taken much longer than it should have, but even the front end of that, right? I worked at Natural Resources Defense Council. Prior to me joining there was a litigation team of amazing attorneys. I think all
Mhm.
women litigated the settlement to replace all the lead pipes in Flint, which was a huge win. And then by the time I got there, the settlement was being enforced, and I got to join that settlement team to help enforce the replacement of all the lead pipes in Flint. And there were times where we had to go back to court to sue the city to make sure that they were staying on task and doing what they were supposed to be doing. And but being a part of that was really significant. I think that for this work, I think it's a win to be able to say, hey, we're going to replace all the lead pipes right in this city is huge. It's a huge deal. I think the same thing. I had a chance to work directly on the Benton Harbor water crisis just last year, actually the year before last, where myself and another attorney filed an emergency petition to replace all the lead pipes at Benton Harbor after they experienced a water crisis that was at the level, actually higher level than Flint, as far as we're
Whoa.
concerned, right? Was probably worse than Flint. That all the pipes got replaced within a year, right? And I think stuff like that is significant. And those are ones I've been directly involved in. Even thinking about things that I haven't been directly involved in, but seeing, I think this issue of General Iron in Chicago, right, where there was a permit to shut down the metal scrapping plant in the north side, the wealthier white part of the community of the city, and move it to the south side, right? Literally pick it up and move all the pollution and environmental degradation to the south side of Chicago, which we know as black and brown community, a
Mhm.
significant immigrant community, Mexican immigrant community. And that got blocked, right? And that took years of advocacy, right? And challenging the permit. And that was sheer grassroots advocacy. You had amazing organizers and activists going on a hunger strike, right? Really call attention to it. You had a number of attorneys working to file Title VI complaints, right, and really challenge the city. And ultimately, they came out and said, we're not, we're going to deny that permit. We're not going to allow them to move forward. And that doesn't happen often, but when it does happen, it's huge, and it shows what's possible when like we really organize, advocate, use all of our tools, and put the pressure on.
I love that so much. No, thank you for highlighting those case studies. I think sometimes people can just feel so discouraged that, like, the law is fixed against our communities and that there's not much people can do. And I think there's some truth in that, right? Like the legal system in the US is kind of what created a lot of the conditions that led to things around redlining, that led to economic disinvestment in communities, that led to the conditions and the vulnerabilities for environmental racism to thrive, right? And so I think there's truth in that, but I think there's also hope that like it can also be a powerful tool as people learn the language and learn how these things work, that it can be a tool to still stand up for yourself and your community. And it may take a long time and you might not even see those wins in your lifetime, but just like all social justice movements, like you said, you're curving closer to be able to carve out those pathways to ideally make it better for future generations. So I love that you presented all of that for sure. So, moving forward off of that, when it comes to legal stuff, just thinking about a lot of the discourse happening today on the internet around, companies not doing the best things and corporations not doing the best thing, there's been this emergence of quote unquote greenwashing. A lot of people talk about it. A lot of people are like, oh, that company's greenwashing, that company's this and that. But I'm just wondering, like, is there actually like legal action people can take against greenwashing? I know it's so much of a gray area, but I just wanted to know your like candid thoughts about that. I was just curious.
Yeah, I think, I'm not quite sure, especially when we talk about private corporations, right? That's a different avenue where these private corporations really have no responsibility to us,
Yeah.
right? And oftentimes it's just like it's marketing ploys and it's,
Yeah.
roundabout ways to seem like they're doing the right thing or good things when they really aren't, right? Beyond like false
Right.
advertising, a lot of times you can skew the data and skew the information. So, I think as it relates to corporations, right, there probably isn't a lot of opportunity for legal action, but that doesn't mean that we can't hold them accountable through other public pressure, accountability and shaming if necessary, right? I think that's really, really important
Yeah.
nonetheless. But from a legal standpoint, probably not as many opportunities. But that all that to say, greenwashing is very real. We see it, we experience it. Those of us, who work in the field, pick up on it pretty quickly and
Totally.
realize there's stuff going on. But yeah,
No, that's really helpful to think about. It's like it's one of those things where like also like in the past, like it's good to look at like past court cases. So in a way, like it's kind of the reverse for like some consumers or even, people who are interested in understanding if a corporation is greenwashing, you can actually look into like some of their legal history, right? To see if like there has been like a lawsuit, like a class action lawsuit or whatever against that company. Like that gives you some signs that they're not necessarily like for communities or like actually trying to come up with solutions that are holding themselves accountable. So I think people could actually use, legal information to kind of give you some more of those feelers or data points to maybe make a bit more of a comprehensive assessment about a company. So I love that you
yeah,
brought that up as well. And so I'm just wondering like, this is such a good conversation, but just from what you're saying with like even what's happened recently with like East Palestine, like, do you think like in a situation like that, like how can community members begin? Like it just seems like I don't know if you know what like the situation's going on there with like, attorneys or anyone going on the ground there, but I'm like, obviously it's getting a lot of press, but is that a situation where like basically like lawyers will come in and like meet with the community? Like I'm just wondering how those processes kind of work.
yeah,
Like
yeah.
like, I
There are
have no idea.
Yeah, no, there are a few different ways. I think in this instance, I think many of the kind of legal organizations have kind of been taking a step back and waiting to see how the community responds, and in particular, waiting for the opportunity, or not even just the opportunity, but are we invited in, right? Our community is asking us to step in and help, and I think that's important in a situation like that, right? Like being invited in, especially we're in the immediate fallout of it, right? And so I know affirmatively, Earth Justice has not been plugged in, has not been involved and been on the ground there, but we've been monitoring it and trying to get a better understanding of what's going on. My understanding is the same with big organizations like in RDC, right? I've also been monitoring and but not necessarily on the ground. My understanding is that there is the local law clinic in Cleveland. I think it's Case Western Law School. Their environmental law clinic is directly plugged in on the ground, starting to work with clients to figure out what next steps are. And that makes sense, right? Because they're a law clinic that's in the community. They know what's going on. They can be there and they can be there to partner. But I'd imagine you're going to have big organizations like ours, like in Earth Justice, like in RDC, who potentially could have a role to play to protect those communities and defend those communities down the line. There's no guarantee. I don't necessarily know that we will, but I think there's definitely space. And to your point, oftentimes in a scenario like that, I think the biggest priority is making sure everybody's safe, healthy, and that they're getting the actual resources they need to remain healthy. And that's what it seems like has kind of at least been as I've kind of watched the news and seen EPA's on the ground there and trying to make sure that folks are getting what they need to stay healthy and so I think that's important. But I wouldn't be surprised if not too far from now you're going to start seeing more conversations around legal action that necessarily should be taking place to clean up that community, fix it, and make those residents whole environmentally, health wise, and financially, quite frankly.
Yeah. And I'm just wondering, like, I'm someone who also comes from a previous organizing background. And so I love meeting people who also have organizing backgrounds. Like, it must be like, it's one of those things where like you go from a space that's very like grassroots to now, working for a bigger organization, or like, you're in the red tape, you're in the bureaucracy. So I'm just wondering, like, how do you find the balance between those things of like, maintaining, your theories of change and like your activism, while also knowing that like you want to work within the system and like, work with these institutions? Like, how do you find the balance between those two things in your own
Yeah.
work and life?
Yeah, I mean, it's frustrating, right? And it requires a lot of patience, right? A lot of patience that I necessarily didn't have when I first started the work, that I have more patience now, right? And
Yeah.
because I look at patience in two ways, right? It's the patience within the organizational work that I do, right? Which I've managed to develop a patience for. But then there's also the patience or impatience of like wanting to get something done, right? Like that's the part that I think kind of helps me balance, right? So I recognize like, okay, there's protocols and processes, especially when we're talking about law, right? Like to your point, like coming from organizing, it was, we organized the communities. We were meeting regularly. When an issue came up, we were ready for public action immediately. We could mobilize within a day. We could mobilize the same day, right, to get some action going and begin to hold people accountable. And that's not the same with law, right? And let alone law in a big organization like an Earth Justice, right, where there are processes and protocols and how we take cases, how they get approved, who approves them, right? What resources and or what limitations do we have, right? So there is that, but I think I appreciate most is that these organizations have begun to become more flexible, have started to become more nimble, and realize that communities don't move at this, and the work doesn't move at the speed that we want it to move at. But when things happen, and we have to be ready to to respond to that and show up
Mhm.
in ways that communities need us. So I think a big part of that, happens between the various teams. So while we do mostly litigation, we have a policy advocacy team, right, that can kind of plug in directly and help kind of think through solutions. We have a partnership team, right, my team, right, that can kind of at least be responsive and kind of provide some support in the meantime while we figure out like the long-term strategies. And we have a comms team and a development team that also offer support to our partners, right, where needed. So I think we figured out ways to provide various types of support in a much faster manner beyond just the litigation aspect of it. But to your point, yeah, it's hard coming from like traditional grassroots organizing to practicing law at a big 600-person organization and having to follow not only the processes of the organization, but then the processes of a court too, right? The court rules,
Mhm.
like it's a lot. It requires patience. So
Yeah, no, I get you. And I love that you brought up that, like, people think it's just one picture. They see the Aaron Brockovich like films of the world, and they're like, it's just this one person who took
yeah,
down this corporation, right? And then, you even watch these TikToks or these videos, and it's just like, I, as one person,
right,
can't do everything. And like, I'm not going to overhaul the whole system. And there's like this very dystopic vision on it all, which, yes, again, like with the frustration, it's like I, as an individual, like, I am limited in the amount that I can do versus like this big system that needs to have a major overhaul, right, when we're
yeah,
addressing the climate crisis. And when it comes to these corporations that, like, it seems very difficult to hold them accountable, right, unless like something happens. And then it's like, okay, but if something happens, we need to prioritize the community. And then like we don't even have as much time to hold the corporation
right,
accountable because we're
right,
trying to make sure the community's all right. So
yep,
anyways, I just feel the frustration, and I like admire that you brought up that like there needs to be comms people, there needs to be policy people. Like, it's not just up to lawyers, and nor
yep,
will it ever be just up to lawyers to be
right,
able to create these methods of accountability and to be able to overhaul a very broken system. It's going to
right,
require so many different levers, methodologies, and theories of change ultimately, right?
yep,
And I love that. I just love that like you embody that, right? Like, it's like you have this background of being very community rooted, but you also understand like how you've had to navigate these systems and try to pull levers where you can. And I think that like that is such a difficult line to tread.
yeah,
And so anyways, I commend you for that. That's crazy. But anyways, on another note on that, for people just like building off of that, like how can, the everyday person who's not a lawyer, how do you think, but they want to engage in climate justice and they feel like they want to take action, like how can they engage with the law? Like, in a way that they could educate themselves in their communities. They don't have to like necessarily wait for an earth justice to come in. Maybe they'll, maybe just want to read up on things, learn, what are some tools that they could be putting in their tool belt from like a legal standpoint, even if like they're not lawyers, to at least begin to observe what's going on in their community, to report things. I don't know, things like that. I'm just wondering if you have tips on that.
Yeah, sure thing. I know there's for me a few different things I always tell people. One, like much of the information I get beyond the work that I do, like I always try to follow like reputable journalists who are like reporting on these stories, right? And reputable just multimedia for folks like yourself, right, who are lifting up these stories and reporting them. So I think that's one, right? Like not just simply reading about it, but finding the information of credible, reputable sources. And so whether that's, for me, I do it in twofold, like finding local sources that I trust and know are going to report objectively on the stories and report the truth. And then you have the national sources, right, that are reporting on some of the broader, bigger issues. So I think one is just understanding the information from those sources. I think is so important to be able to understand it. I think too, right? It sounds simple, right? But being able to talk about that information and share that information out to your family, your friends, your community, right? It's, like we oftentimes even like you talk about social media, you're sitting on Twitter or Instagram all day and you may not think much about it, but there's so many times where I'll just, retweet a story or share a story, and then, hour later, somebody will text me like, "Hey, I saw that story you shared. Can you tell me more about it?" Or somebody will DM me about stuff, right? I think that's thinking of ways, accessible ways to easily get involved, right? And then also too, I think there are, as we talk about how can the individual get involved. I think like joining some of the many kind of coalitions and organizations either within your community or nationally that are talking about these issues and working to tackle these issues, I think is so important, right? And at this point in time, right, where as opposed to a few years ago, right, there's no shortage of organizations, grassroots organizations that are organizing, and you don't need much to be involved, right? You just need to have the time, right, and the willingness to commit to oftentimes some very small tasks, right, to get plugged in. So I think it's those things, right? I think it's finding the resources and the reputable resources. It's communicating about those issues, and then it's joining with other people, right? So that we're not just the individual in our silo, but that we're actually building community that can talk about and advocate for these issues.
No, I love that. I mean, I think it's just one of those things where like, I think people think you have to get this master's, PhD, get these higher ed degrees to get involved, to make a difference. But like, I think, it's not. Everyone has their own journey. And it's like, even for yourself, like you realize like that was your pathway that made sense, but it doesn't have to be every person's pathway, right? It's just like, this is the way you utilize the tools and the knowledge of your community to know that this is how you wanted to, be in your truth, stand up and take action. And I think if, that's authentic to you. And it's like, everyone needs to find what that authentic path is that will really make them feel connected to their community, connected to the causes and the issues going on, and to take action the most strategically way possible. Not trying to be this like ultimate expert, because we don't have time for that anymore. We don't have time to wait for everyone to get PhDs. We're gonna be dead by the time we're gonna wait for everyone to have a PhD and a law degree. Like, we don't have time for that. We just don't. We don't have time. We just don't.
Yeah, I agree.
Like, anyways. It's like, partner with the lawyers. You don't have to be a lawyer, even though we have amazing people doing that work. And it's just great to learn from you all. And there's so much opportunity for partnership and information sharing that I think people who work on these cases can continue to share with communities so they can use these tools, learn these case studies, right? Like, even finding out about legal case studies. I mean, I've done a lot of content in the past on legal case studies around communities, and like, people always find those really fascinating because people are like, oh, this is an example of taking this very, not theoretical, but just like textbook issue around quote unquote environmental justice, but you actually see how it pans out and it tells a story, right? And so I think if people were going to use the law as a tool for their activism, use it to study case studies, understand how communities have stood up for themselves using these tools, to understand how that actually pans out, what are the barriers and limitations, and then use these other tools around organizing, communications, joining organizations to get involved in addition to understanding the litigation piece. So anyways, you made me realize that. Look at that. We're tying all the dots together. I love it. But anyways, yeah, I'm just wondering, like, on the Brown Girl Green show, the last thing I like to end off with is just like advice for listeners. Obviously, you gave advice on how people can take action, but like in terms of just like navigating a path, right? Like, I think there's so much imposter syndrome or, struggles and doubts that people can face when they want to take action on these issues. I'm just wondering, like, what is your advice for people on like, how can they feel empowered to go on their own journey? Like, what are your words of advice?
It's really about staying engaged and staying involved, because I genuinely believe that we're on the cusp of like transformational change as it relates to climate and environmental justice, right? And I say that because we're seeing, especially in the U.S., right, we're seeing historic investments to tackle issues of climate and water in ways that we've never seen before. Literal historic financial investments in ways that we haven't seen before. We're seeing, not just rhetoric, but actual action to change our climate and clean energy infrastructure and change our water infrastructure, right, to deliver on a healthy environment in communities. We're seeing states around the country pass constitutional amendments to ensure the right to clean air and clean water. And all that to say, right, I know it feels like climate change is a daunting task. I know it feels like, protecting and cleaning up all the water in America is a daunting task, but like the movement needs you, right? It needs us to stay engaged, right? I know we're also seeing historic investments, we're also seeing historic pushback from polluters and corporations who want to maintain the status quo. And the reason they're spending so much money fighting back, right, and pushing back and greenwashing, doing all these things in the way that they are, is because they know that we're right on the cusp of victory and transformational change. And this feels like a last stand, right, of industry and polluters to push back with all that they have. And so all that to say, like, stay encouraged, stay involved. As I said, like the movement needs you, and it feels like we are right there. So
Love it. No, thank you so much. And how can people stay in touch with you and the work that you do?
yeah, sure thing, guy. I'm not a huge social media person, but I do have Twitter and I do have LinkedIn. So on Twitter, you can follow me on Twitter. It's just Jeremy F. Orr. That's it. Just same on LinkedIn as well. I post a lot about, my work in climate and environmental justice, as well as like sports and hip hop music and other stuff. But yes, you can follow me there and on LinkedIn and on Twitter for sure.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining today's episode. I learned so much and just enjoyed connecting with you as your LinkedIn friend. He really is fire on LinkedIn. You gotta follow him on LinkedIn. But yeah, thank you everyone for tuning in to this week's episode of Brown Girl Green. I'm Christy Drutman, and I interview diverse environmental leaders and advocates about creative solutions to the climate crisis. And I'm working to change the image of what it means to be an environmentalist in the 21st century. Thank you so much, Jeremy, for joining us this week.
Thank you.